Okay, so first of all, what I'd like to do before we open up the questions to you would be just to get things rolling and introduce everybody. I'm just going to ask the reporters here a couple of questions so we get to talk to everybody. First of all, Ramita, obviously Syria, what would you say, if you can even put it in one sentence, would be the most challenging aspect or the hardest part of doing that story?
Just getting the camera out was challenging. We had to really just stay under the radar. And the Syrians have got an amazing network. The government has got an amazing network of paid informers. And we really have been warned. The minute you get a camera out, you're asked questions, and it's true. Checkpoints, military checkpoints. We passed a few military checkpoints. That felt quite hairy, because there are few tourists in Syria, and we were posing as tourists. But I think the biggest challenge for us was keeping the people we were with safe, even though actually they spent most of the time making sure we were safe. It was quite clear that if they got caught, they would be imprisoned, and they would probably be tortured, and that's big responsibility.
So for helping you, that could have happened, you mean? Or?
Yes, yes. So whenever we filmed with them, whenever we met them, every step of the way, we thought, how can we keep them safe? So, okay, we won't travel with them in the car, for example. So if we are stopped, they won't be with us. So just little details like that just consumed us all the time, just to keep these guys safe. And they were just wonderful, amazing, brave men.
And when you say to get the camera out, you mean actually physically filming, just the idea of getting a camera where anybody could see you filming?
Absolutely. So just, driving around Damascus, we just didn't want to take any risks. Of course, before we went, I'd spoken to a few photographers and a few journalists who had been in Damascus, and a photographer told me that he had been taking photos of, I can't remember, some historical monument downtown, and he was stopped, arrested, taken away, simply for taking photos. So we really didn't want to take any chances. So, I mean, it was hard, and the Wael Dabous, the producer, did an amazing job to get what he did, considering that, it was always surreptitious, always filming, kind of keeping the camera low.
Let's just ask also, that moment when you're in the house there, and you could hear the soldiers next door, I mean, I've never been in that situation, but what was going through your mind? Were you thinking, what am I going to do if they knock on the door, or what was going through your mind, perhaps?
We were absolutely terrified. The guys had escape routes, which was outside, jumping out the windows. They'd chosen that safe house because of two escape routes. Of course, there were security forces, militia, right outside the escape route, so they were scared if they jumped out, they'd be shot. So the whole escape plan just went to pot. That's when they were forced to hide in this cupboard. They said to us, listen, locking the door will give you a few extra minutes. Sit opposite the door as far away as you can, because when they bang down the door, they're going to storm in and they're going to start beating you up. Hold your British passports high and just start talking English, and make sure they don't come anywhere near the cupboard.
Great.
Yes. So we hadn't slept. I mean, we'd kind of been on tenterhooks, getting word from lookouts that the raids were getting nearer and nearer until they finally happened in our street, and we could hear them. And the sound was just horrendous. We could hear hundreds of marching boots, and then windows smashing, doors being banged down, and screaming, and we heard people being beaten up. So we just sat there, just holding our passports above our heads, just ready for them to knock down the door, and we were really, really lucky. But of course, as terrified as we were, if the guys had been caught, we would have been, I like to think we would have been kind of fine. It wouldn't have been nice, but the guys wouldn't have been fine. And
because of their activities?
Yeah, we'd spent 3 days getting to know these men, and they were wonderful men. And that, it was upsetting to think that could happen to these men. They thought they'd be killed. For their work? If they got caught, they thought they'd be killed, yeah. And one of them had already been arrested simply for having been seen at a protest, a peaceful protest where he's just chanting freedom. And he had scars all over his back, horrific torture scars. So, to be caught in a safe house, that their laptops were everywhere. It was obvious that they were activists with us. yeah, it would have been bad.
I'm sure we'll come back to more on that a bit later, I'm sure. Shay, a different sort of story, but also a very different challenge. I imagine just convincing the doctor to give you access might have been difficult, but what was the most challenging or the hardest part for you?
Well, I think, yeah, definitely the access challenge just carried on all the way through, everything that you wanted to do. When you mentioned churches, and particularly when you mentioned churches, filming in a church, to a church, it was just a no-no. And I think what made that worse and what made it harder was Nigeria generally. It's such a difficult place to operate, and Lagos in particular. It's very similar to London in that it was never planned, it was never designed, but there's a much bigger population, and that means something very different in Africa. So during the rainy season there were floods, and there were all kinds of really quite mundane things that would mean you couldn't get from A to B. A half-hour journey would take you 3 hours. You'd get there and realise the person you're supposed to meet couldn't make it because he was stuck in a flood somewhere else. And then a lot of the time you'd have that meeting and it would be with a church who had various reasons for not wanting us to film their activities. So that didn't always work out exactly how we expected.
So that's the thing. I mean, first of all, why were they so suspicious? Why were churches, if they're helping people and bringing the word of God to their population, why were they suspicious of you filming? And how did you then convince Dr. Sian Fireman that you were...
there are churches and there are churches. The Anglican or Catholic churches would never have had a problem with us filming. They invited us to do so on a number of occasions. I've filmed in many in Nigeria. Obviously there are certain churches who know that they are likely to get a lot of criticism. They know that their way of preaching isn't palatable, particularly in the West, and so they know that they don't want to be part of our operation. They don't want to be part of it at all. With Dr. Sian Fireman, he was, and this is one of the things that I thought was particularly good about this film, is that Fireman isn't an established pastor. There are pastors in Nigeria who are worth millions, tens of millions of dollars, US dollars, and Fireman isn't quite there yet. He's on his way. He's building up. He's growing the church, as he puts it, growing the business, as he puts it. So he was really keen to get some publicity. He was really keen to be seen, to be in the same league as the people who have foreign journalists come to interview them. And we exploited that, I have to be honest. We allowed him to feel he was going to get from us what he wanted, and we let him go with that. We knew that there was going to have to be, during this film, during the whole film, a certain amount of biting your tongue. When you've seen something that you obviously don't feel very comfortable about, you're going to have to bite your tongue and let the next few days play out. You need to give the man a chance to speak for himself and show you what he has to show. So there was a lot of letting him assume what he wanted to assume.
And how did it go when you inevitably had to ask him a few hard questions?
2 weeks of saving it all up was it told in the end. It didn't go brilliantly. He felt let down. He felt like, in fairness to him, he felt like we'd abused his trust, that we spent a lot of time with him, and we didn't ask him difficult questions when we could easily have done so. So he kind of felt like, these guys like me. So it was difficult to have to do that. But I've been thinking about this film for a few years. I've been planning it for a couple of months. So I was ready to ask him those questions. I didn't really hold back. I probably could have done a bit more, but I didn't. He didn't like the process at all. Understandable.
But in fairness to him, you had to have that discussion.
We had to have that discussion. You know, it was I couldn't produce a documentary in which I questioned certain things that he said or shown me without giving him the opportunity to counter that.
Exactly. Jen, in Uganda,
yes,
with those amazing little children, I was always very moved by the little boy there who thought he was, considered as wildlife, but you handled him so well by saying it was just other people's opinions. But what did you find the hardest thing of this? I mean, the hardest part of doing that story?
Well, I've just come back from doing another film, a very different film, and each film has its own challenges. And in Uganda, we were filming in this completely remarkable hospital where run completely by Ugandans. It's funded by an American charity, but the surgeon was Ugandan, the doctors were Ugandan, all the nurses were Ugandan. And normally you would have some sort of problems with getting access to a hospital like that or a medical facility like that. There would be certain conditions put on you being there. And my director, Sume Autumn, Sume's over there, we found that there was no problems with access at all. They granted us complete free rein to film whatever we wanted, to talk to whatever patients we wanted. The one representative of the American charity, so the one Westerner who worked in the operation, was actually away getting married at the time. And whereas you'd normally imagine most charities would say, oh, you can't come and film during these 2 weeks when we were away, he trusted his staff and said, no, you know, they'll take care of you, you film whatever you like. So we didn't have problems with access. We had certain problems in that the surgeon, who, if you've seen the film, you'll see that the surgeon is very knowledgeable, very erudite. He's also incredibly camera shy and used to run away when he saw me and Sume, which was awful. And he only really gave us a proper interview. He would only do it when he was wearing his surgical mask. And at first I thought he was joking when he said he was scared of cameras, but he really was. He said the only photograph he had of him was his passport photo. He would never let anyone take his picture, which is such a shame because he speaks so well. So I guess there was a challenge in getting him to talk to us. There was also, you know, there were language issues because in Uganda there are many, many different groups of people. They all speak different languages. It's not possible to find one person who speaks all the different languages that you might find in this hospital because people travel from all over the country to get there. And I guess perhaps logistically what we had wanted originally when we went there would be to film with a family at home to see what it's like living with this condition. See them going to hospital for treatment and then see them after they'd had treatment to see how their lives have improved. But the biggest issue we found in Uganda is not so much getting the treatment, because the treatment is there and it's free. It's getting access to the hospital because transport is so expensive, and most people, you know, one of the main characters in our film, it's a little boy called Kazimiri. His mother saved for 6 months to take him to the hospital. She earns less in 6 months than the return fare from her home to the hospital. And her son was so incredibly advanced and in such a terrible state. I mean, he could not sit up on his own. He couldn't do anything. He was 9 months old and he couldn't do anything. All he could do was lie down. And he was given a form of treatment that will mean he's going to have to go back again and again for follow-up, and she just had no idea how she was going to take him back to the hospital because her family was bankrupt from taking him there once. So it was a challenge for us because we couldn't film these people at home first and then filming them going to the hospital, because the way the hospital works is as soon as people arrive, they're given surgery immediately. They can't just do an assessment and send them home. So it's a great hospital to film in, but we had to be kind of quite inventive about how to tell people's stories. But I think we were lucky. We didn't have the access problems that Shay had, certainly, because everybody was very open and the hospital just wanted us to film everything, I think because they were justifiably proud of what they were doing.
Were the parents happy for you to film immediately? Were they open to that idea? I mean, imagine some parents might have been quite private about that, or shy, or...
They were really happy to be filmed, and from what they told me, it was because at home they had been treated like freaks. They'd been treated like they'd brought, you know, satanic spirits into the village, or that their children were cursed, and they had been shunned in their villages. And I think they felt it, I know because they said this to us and to our local producer out there, that it made them feel special that a Western crew wanted to film them and took an interest in their child. And I personally found all of the children in the film, genuinely, they were beautiful. They were disfigured by this condition, but they were still very much recognisably children. And I think they liked their children being treated as beautiful and rather than as kind of freaks of nature. Right.
And you've just been to Honduras.
Yes.
And I want to ask about that because it's a particularly challenging logistical
Yes,
film.
This is a very different kind of film. I made a film, the film that we're making at the moment is about mosquito men, so that's men from the Mosquito Coast who are being killed and left paralysed in their thousands diving for lobsters, and these are lobsters that are eaten in America and in Europe. They're diving too deep and they come up and they get decompression sickness and it leaves them paralysed, and a lot of them die. And to make this film we had to go and dive on, well, we didn't dive, thank God, but we had to go and join them on a fishing expedition in the Caribbean, which was quite an incredible experience. Here's Krish. Hello. Sorry.
And here's Krishnan Guru-Murthy.
And here's Krishnan Guru-Murthy.
For those of you who don't know him already. There you go.
Yeah, no, that was a difficult experience because for completely different reasons, in that we were filming on a boat and it was very, very cramped and everything got wet and we got seasick and there was no space, and I was the only woman on a boat with 150 men who were watching lots of porn and getting very drunk all the time. And so that's going to be an interesting film. You should tune in for that
Less detail there, I think.
But you know, quite often I always say that on these films, the most stressful things that can happen is that somebody gets ill or injured, or that the story isn't working. And as long as neither of those things are happening, all of those challenges, they can be incorporated into the film, I think. And hopefully that's what's going to come through on the next one.
I'll give Krishnan just a moment to gather his thoughts, as he's just rushed from the newsroom right now. We're just discussing the challenges and the upside of some of the particular stories we've been on. Peter, in Russia, what did you find perhaps the most surprising, or perhaps even uplifting, if there is one of those, in your experience in Russia chasing Putin's army? I mean, the women singing that song were quite extraordinary, and the Nashi themselves, the way they were behaving with the police. But was there a sort of a surprising part of this for you?
Well, I hadn't really been properly to Moscow before, and there are quite a lot of surprising things about Moscow. The first one is that you don't see any black people. This isn't in the film, it's just very surprising. You've got an enormous amount of racism, but no black people. There is, you don't see hardly any pregnant women, and you hardly ever see a child. It's a sort of, it's quite gripping in that way. But in terms of having made a few unreported worlds, what the most extraordinary thing, which I hadn't anticipated, because the wonderful thing about unreported world films is they make themselves. They tell you what the film is. You go somewhere and you discover what the film is going to be. You don't go out there with an idea. Is that the dominant figures were all women.
Carry on, Peter.
It is the case, I like to think anyway, is that the dominant figures in this film were without exception women. And that is, having made loads of other films in Africa and the Middle East, it's often very hard to have a woman in the film at all. But the Masha, the commissar of the Putin youth, for instance, was a formidable woman. I mean, absolutely extraordinary. And the political leaders on the other side were also women, and they had men in attendance, but it was the women who came through. And likewise, there was an amazing thing we all went to, James Jones and me, the Wednesday night supper club, which was a whole load of women having supper on a Wednesday night.
I'm not sure where this is going.
All their husbands were in jail, charged with...
It's getting better.
And they were very beautiful. Many of them were absolutely fantastic. But
and their husbands were in jail?
And their husbands were locked up in Siberia.
Locked up in Siberia? Really?
Yeah, and before many of them had been the victims of the notorious K department of the FSB, the new KGB. And they were fighting for justice for their husbands. And we followed some of these stories of these women as they fought for justice for that, because they'd been locked up because they'd been involved in political activity maybe, or simply because the oligarchy which surrounds Putin had wanted their money or their businesses.
Extraordinary. Ollie, you've travelled the world in various forms, and this story in Australia was obviously maybe a difficult one to go and do, because I imagine the access to such a private and closed community might have been quite difficult. But what did you find perhaps surprising or even uplifting from that experience, and maybe your other trips as well?
Yeah, I mean, Australia, we were told that it was going to be a very difficult place to operate, not least by yourself, who's Australian. And it was. I mean, when we got there, we went to speak to people, went to speak to the elders in the community of Alice Springs. And we had been told that they really didn't like talking to outside journalists and outside media, because, well, we were told for lots of different reasons, including that they felt there had been people were misrepresenting what was really going on in their lives. So when we were sitting down with the one particular elder, I asked him, I said, why don't you like Western outside journalists coming to talk to you? And he said, well, because no one actually asks us what we think. And then he laughed. And he said, "Are you going to ask us what we think? Because if you're not, you can get out." And unfortunately, I laughed, and I could see he had a sense of humour about it, which is something which often it's. I suppose our stories always revolve around the humanity of the people that we meet, and that's always, in my mind, one of the most uplifting components of it. And it comes out in the strangest situations. It comes out in a moment of bizarre comedy where I was completely off my, didn't know how to respond to that. But there was a very serious message behind it. And I think the success and the enjoyment of making these films, because we all love what we do, let's not beat ourselves up about it, is when you have those rare moments where you can actually feel like you're people letting you into their lives, which is an enormous privilege, and to be able to give them a voice, which is.
Did you find that they did open up to you? Did they eventually? I mean, it must have taken some time to get that trust.
Yes, it did, and it was very difficult, and it took sort of the strangest. I mean, every community that we film in is very different. This particular one, it seemed we didn't film for the first 3 or 4 days, and we're on a tight budget. We got the boss sitting over there saying, calling in, and you're saying you haven't filmed anything, and you have to hold your nerve and say, look, we need to earn people's trust, earn their respect, just by having a game of football, or going for a walk, or going to the shops. Very basic things. And it was a very, very slow process, but they did start to open up and start to reveal their lives to us when they did when they trusted us.
You also did the amazing story in China about the handicapped boy. What stays with you now, looking back on that a few months later? What stays with you perhaps the most about that story?
That he still hasn't been found. It's heartbreaking. It's one of those things you always think. You make a film, you come back, and you think, so what, quite frankly? Have you changed anyone's life? You put people's lives in danger. Can you do anything about it? And if you can't, then you're left with a sort of a sense of hopelessness, I think. So to be able to try and carry on and try and help his father, who's still out looking for him, is something we're trying to do. We've managed to get the national press to take it up, and the China Youth Daily have picked it up and been very aggressive towards the government about it, which is very brave on their part. And they've held, they're holding the government to account over it, saying, why won't you allow this man to register his son as missing? Because they're not. And to be able to support them in what we can do, it's a thin line that you go down. Yes, we're journalists, we're reporting on things, but if you feel something and something happens, you've got to see what you can do. We're trying to help.
Krishnan, welcome.
Thank you.
On many levels to the program as well as to this evening. Obviously, if Krishnan Guru-Murthy is now presenting the program, I'd like to ask you about that. But first of all, the story in South Africa. I noticed it got some play in the South African press. Your encounter with Malema, the clip we saw earlier on, which was entertaining but also very revealing about his attitude to being questioned about his wealth. What did you find about that story that was actually maybe stayed with you the most?
The Malema story sort of fell into our laps by accident while we were there. It had been bubbling along and we wanted to do it, but then it blew up as well while we were there. So there were new allegations made while he was there, and we had this debate about should we try and follow him around, should we just try and doorstep him, should we just chase him, will we get a sequence of me calling out after him and not really getting anything? And then he called a press conference and said, we're gonna answer any questions. And so I just sort of piled in there and was the first, I sort of did that sort of slightly elbows thing and sort of piled in first and just kept asking questions. And it was a funny experience because it was basically in all the South African press, on the front page of the papers and on the radio and all the rest of it. Basically because he had thrown a British journalist out of a press conference once before. And he referenced that as well, and he sort of said, "Oh, you're just trying to wind me up. You're trying to get me to do what I did to that other guy." But at the same time, there was quite a lot of menace in there as well. In that, he may not have been about to throw me out of the press conference, but there was a sense of sort of they were really cross about it. The whole experience. I'm the new boy. I've only done one of these films. The whole experience is so different to doing the news, basically, in that. I know what Peter means, why you sort of go there and you just kind of, the film sort of unfolds in front of you and you just have to sort of go with it and find what you think the story is. But I also felt that because there's so much more time to breathe and think about how you feel about the story yourself, which doesn't matter. It doesn't even matter how I feel about it, but inevitably you do. I found my own sort of feelings about what was going on in South Africa being pulled around, quite between sort of extremes, and that my instinct, coming from a news background, is always to challenge, not just to say, how do you feel? It must be terrible for you, but to also say, well, what are you doing for yourself? Why are you sitting around in a slum?
Yeah, because you lived with the people.
Yeah, and so I went there and sort of found myself thinking, all these guys, they go off and live on building sites and build other people's houses, then they come home and they're living in shacks that are falling down. Why don't you do something about that initially? So I found myself sort of having quite a reactionary attitude towards it. And then after a while, after spending more time with them, you start to understand their sense of betrayal and their sense of letdown and what they expected from the government and the regime and why they are so depressed. And spending the night there was very informative as well. And it's just this sort of the relentless depression of living in one of these places. It's cold, you can't think, and all that kind of stuff. I started to have a much sort of deeper sense of sympathy with everything they were saying. And then I went off to the government and met Trevor Manuel. And Trevor Manuel said, well, what are these people doing for themselves? They're just complaining, and who promised them a house? Nobody promised them a house, So I found my sort of feelings about actually what I was seeing sort of pulled around all over the place, partly because of the product of the process, if you like, is that you just go there and you find out what's going on, and you talk to people, and then normally, if I'm doing a news trip, I'll have made all those calls in advance, and I'll have spoken to Trevor Manuel beforehand, so I know what he's going to say, and I know what the people in the camp think, and it's all sort of laid out, and I kind of know what the piece is before I've done it. This was a very, very different experience, and great from that point of view.
Great. I mean, a lot of what you said in the story was picked up, I think, in the South African press as well afterwards. A call for an inquiry.
Yeah.
The
Trevor Manuel call was the first time a senior ANC figure in the cabinet had said Julius Malema should be opened up to financial scrutiny. So that was sort of a little news line in there that got us back into the papers.
Yeah, which gets
after
back
the film went out.
Exactly, it gets back to Ollie's point that it actually does have an impact locally, and we find that with a lot of stories we actually do.
Yeah.
What could we just explain also your new role at the programme? What is your primary objective now?
My primary objective is to sort of join this very accomplished team and try and do. One of the films every series, but we'll also there's partly sort of an insider TV bit to me doing it, which is we have Channel 4 News from 7 to 7:30. That hour on Channel 4 from 7 o'clock throughout the week is generally a news hour, and so it sort of makes sense to join up Channel 4 News with Unreported World. It's the same sort of people who are watching on the whole, and so if we can, instead of having an ad break and plenty of opportunities for audiences to switch over and see what's on BBC One or anything like that. It's a TV trick, basically, of saying, don't go away, Unreported World's on in a minute, and it's fantastic, and here's what it's about. And so I'll be introducing every film and saying, and basically saying that, here's what it's about, and then the films themselves, nothing about the programme itself has changed, other than I get to introduce it, and then the little bonus is that we get to update. The genuine bonus of me doing it, I suppose, is that we get to update the stories very, very briefly at the end, where I will come back into vision and say, well, since that happened, Julius Malema is facing a disciplinary hearing. What's happened to some of the people in the film, the kids in the Uganda film, what happened to them? So it will give us an opportunity to say, because some of these films are filmed maybe 2 or 3 months before they're actually transmitted. What's happened in that intervening period? So they're calling me an ambassador for Unreported World rather than the presenter of the programme.
Oh, I like that.
I'm just I'm topping and tailing most of the films and giving it a bit of a push.
It's very important. That back announce really is something that people have constantly told us is something they would like to know. It's like, what happened to those people? Can you go back and see them again? And what you do with that in that role will satisfy, I think, a lot of people. Can we perhaps open up now to some questions from the audience? Hopefully there's lots of interesting questions. Not just about Krish's role, but that's very important to us. So we'd like to start perhaps with that, if there's any questions, and also to welcome anybody who feels that they are, up and coming journalists, camera people, directors, producers, people who want to do our jobs and take us off the screen eventually, because this is a very important part of what we want to do, is actually have an engagement with people like yourselves about what we're doing and what you'd like to do as well. So perhaps we could start. Ollie?
Can we ask questions to the audience as well?
In your turn, Ollie, yes, you may, yeah, no, in a second. That would be good. So perhaps the lady there.
I'm Katie Harrison from Tier Fund. I really like the idea about bringing updates and helping the audience to go on a journey with some of the people that they've met. And I know that Unreported World has done some really good stuff social media-wise as well to help the audience to understand the issues. I just wondered if you could talk through how you see that going and what kind of feedback you generally get from viewers, how they like to engage with the characters that we meet in the stories.
Well, I'll attempt to answer that in the beginning, and we can maybe throw it to other people as well. I think Ramita and Jen and Ollie do a lot of work in that way. I mean, the following the story through with social media is becoming an increasingly important part of what we do. Obviously, we've got to engage, and we want to engage at that level, and we find a lot of people engaging with us at that level. I mean, not just through Twitter and Facebook and everything else, but obviously through mounting campaigns or letting people know what they can do about it, picking up on a number of points made tonight. So I would say that it's a very important part of strategy from Channel 4's point of view as well, that we want to do more, if that makes any sense to you. Would you like to?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that there is a lot of extra stuff on the Channel 4 website around every film, and if you haven't seen it, you should go and check it out. There are video extras. Each of us writes a blog that goes with each film. There's a page of related links of how you can help. Certainly after my Uganda film, a lot of people got in touch and said that they wanted to help the families, help the hospital that we'd been filming in, and all the information was there on the Channel 4 website. It's fascinating when you're watching a film to get all this feedback on Twitter and Facebook, and it's quite interesting to see what people are responding to, which particular parts of the film. Sometimes it's not always the bits that you thought that they would remember. And I think all of us, we follow all of that, and we all respond to people who get in touch with us that way, and it's definitely something that we're encouraged to do for the future.
Can I pick that up with you, perhaps? I mean, you're a very interactive entity on Channel 4.
Yeah, I mean, we're a relatively small and easy to reach community. And especially with Twitter and email these days, people do just ask you direct questions about, where's the hospital, how do I get in touch, how do I donate money? I mean, and that's not unique to Unreported World. It tends to be any of these sorts of documentaries that are about people who move audiences. We will put as much information as we can up on the website around it. And I think, Unreported World is now, it's ungeo-blocked, if you like, so you can watch it anywhere around the world. It's on iTunes as a podcast, and we are all reachable on Twitter. So, following up stories, and I'm sure, if the opportunity arises, we will always be able to update what's happened to people. So, if Anna and Tuesday, the woman who had me to stay in my camp, gets a house, I'll probably hear about it because they've got all my details, and I'll tweet it, or I'll let the audience know. So I think it's kind of much easier these days.
I agree. Yes.
Hi. Documentary work, especially the amazing documentary work that you all do, for a lot of journalists is like the gold standard or the dream job. So I was wondering, what would you say, what would you recommend to young journalists who would really like to get into documentary work? For anyone.
Make them. There's nothing to stop you making them now. It's so easy, it's so cheap. And you will know what a documentary is. You know what the ingredients of a documentary are. It's about character, it's about narrative, it's about integrity. I mean, the thing I find a bit dangerous, and I've met a few people along the way who are making what they think are documentaries, but actually it's manipulated reality, and they're not really telling the truth. And I think you've got to be very wary of that in terms of how you sell it. Nothing wrong with those sorts of films, as long as you're honest about it. But I mean, I don't know what anyone said, but I mean, it's so easy now to buy a cheap camera and go and make a documentary and put it on YouTube and get an audience. And I think that's the best way to learn.
Well, I think you pick up on that. I mean, you get out there and do it. Be places that you're passionate about, find a topic that you care about, but don't go down the path of allowing it to manipulate you. Keep a distance and tell the story as impassionately as you can in some ways, but also get engaged, if that makes sense. But be careful with what you're saying. But just get out there and seek advice. talk to as many people as you can who are actually in the business making these things, and pursue a path that you'd like to pursue. But seek advice as well. Very important. Anybody else?
Yeah, no, I've met quite a few people making documentaries in different countries I've been to. I suppose the only additional thing I'd say would be to try and be relatively professional. Evan's kind of, and Krish has mentioned, sort of stepping back and trying to be objective about things, but also setting yourself limits in terms of time and money that you want to spend, amount of time you want to spend on the ground, and it really helps to focus the mind on the job at hand, and ultimately it's the kind of skill that you're going to need to bring with you into making making documentaries for TV.
I'd also say you should watch a lot of documentaries and work out who's making the documentaries that you think are really good, and get in touch with them and see if you can work with them, learn from them. Also, work out why you think certain documentaries work. Sometimes it's fantastic storytelling, sometimes it's got amazing actuality, sometimes it's got amazing characters. There are different things you can learn from different ones. So watch as many as you can, and even watching a bad documentary is useful because you can work out why it's bad.
And if you can afford it, and a lot of people can't, I accept that. A lot of documentary makers have no money to pay staff. So if you go and volunteer to go and help with research and do that, a lot of them are quite receptive to it.
Yes, we are.
Could I make a further observation to all of this? I'm very lucky to come into this business very late in life as a reporter. And I do feel rather an imposter, to be honest, because I'm always aware whenever I go, whenever I've had the enormous good luck to make a lot of these, present a lot of these, that the person who's really doing the work is the director-cameraman. It's in the case of the Moscow film, James Jones, and he did, to be honest, and this is true of every documentary I've ever made, Unreported World, is to be the director-cameraman who does the work, does the journalism, does the sound, does the vision, it does the whole bloody lot.
Speak for yourself.
Yeah, exactly.
That is, it does well, it is the case. I have to say this, that I am incredibly impressed by, I have no doubt, I'm completely candid about it. And it does strike me that there is a distinction to be made between the reporting job, which seems to me to be remarkably enjoyable and easy in some words, and the guy actually behind the camera, which seems to me to be incredibly difficult.
Well, it's a point well made. I can't make an impartial statement, so we will have to move on. But the producer directors who are not here tonight, except for James and Sumay, obviously are an incredibly important part of the team. And I'd like to also say tonight, just here now, while I think of it, that Unreported World is a team. So those of you who are interested in doing this, it is we're on camera, we're on screen, but the enormous amount of energy and dedication that goes behind the scenes, Amy Matthews and George Waldron, series producer and editor up the back there, obviously, and everybody else is really, really important. And if you're interested in doing this, there's a lot of jobs you can do that are very, very important. So anyway, keep that in mind as well.
Just to, we're thanking people. I think
sorry, I forgot Siobhan Sinnerton there. Just while I think of it.
In my mind, the most important person in all our films is the people we work with on the ground in country, our fixers, who provide the access. And it's an extraordinary skill, and that's, in my mind, where a lot of films make or break, down on those extraordinary people who work.
And risk their lives, as you were talking about.
And have to stick around in the country after we've left when the film's gone out. So.
Yeah. Which, just on your point there, I mean, really it is about the local context you do have and develop and protect and look after. So, moving on, can we just, okay.
Yep. Sorry. Hi, I'm just interested who and how you find the stories.
Okay, well I'll launch off by just saying it's extremely difficult. It's almost like trying to find stories for Unreported World at the moment, where you're not doing what's on the news, you're trying to do something different, you're trying to find strong characters, you're trying to find a story that we haven't seen before in an engaging way, is very difficult. And I think it's just a matter of keeping your antenna up and keeping for those sorts of stories. Again, it really is down to Siobhan at Channel 4, who is the gatekeeper on this, who constantly prompts us to say, I think I've heard of that before, go away and do better. And it really is quite tough, but it is very gratifying when you do get there, and I think the stories on this series demonstrate that. But
I think we should also say there is a dedicated team of people in the office who sit in the office and come up who research these stories and come up with them and don't get to go and make them. Well, they do eventually, but it's a very, very difficult job, and they have many different places they look for the stories. They have lots of different contacts. Sometimes the stories come from us, sometimes they come from completely outside, but it's an extremely difficult process. We've been making this series for a very long time. We can't do the same story twice, but we have a fantastic research team in the office who have their antennae firmly extended.
But if you think there are stories we should be doing, please
Yes.
Contact us.
We're desperately in.
I'm going to keep things moving because there are a few hands now coming up. Sorry, the lady there.
So just on stories, I just wondered if there was a subject issue in a country that the Unreported World series is desperate to cover. So do you want to get inside with that?
I don't want to give away too much because I get in real trouble. Let me just say that there are some fascinating places we'd like to go, and we're working very hard to get there.
Ramita, I just want to know more about operating in Syria, were you followed, how suspicious they were, where, staying places and hotels. I mean, I just want to know more about those logistics.
The tourist visa, we got a tourist visa, it was 15 days. We were told that we would be followed. We weren't aware of it, but we were very careful. Didn't film for the first 4 days, the fourth because YL had Damascus belly. But we were very careful. There were moments, there were a few occasions where we realised that the net was closing in. It really felt like the net was closing in. So we did change hotels very frequently. As soon as we realised that our car had been spotted at a protest, we changed our car. So we're just always on the move. And of course, just taking advice from the activists we were working with. They've all been arrested so many times, I've learned all the tricks. So they really know how to operate.
Okay. James. Sorry.
Hey, so fairly recently, you guys were made available to anyone in the world to view online. I was kind of wanting to ask, has that changed how you think about presenting and making the films you produce? And also, I mean, what does it add to you guys as a consideration?
I'll kick off briefly by just saying I don't think it's affected what we do or how we do it at all, except for the identity of individuals who may want to be have their identity hidden, which we would have done anyway. But we're extra careful about that. That will be one thing, because it can be played back in their country, obviously. I don't think it affects the type of stories or what we would do in that story at all. And the idea, I think, is effectively to broaden, to offer Unreported World for what it is, which is a fantastic international standard current affairs program.
Yeah, I think it makes a huge difference. In Nigeria, just looking at the most recent example, there was a film where we were going to go to a different country, look at how they practice their religion, albeit the same religion as ours on paper, and then ask questions about that, which is kind of pointless if it only goes out to people in this country. So suddenly there was a point to making that film. People in Nigeria are going to watch it. They too are involved in this debate, and here I am contributing to that debate. And suddenly it made sense, and it made a big difference when we were talking to people on the ground and talking about them taking part. It was a bit like, this isn't just something that you'd be doing for us, two random guys who you've just met, and you'll never see it again, and that's the end of it. Actually, this is something that may impact your life.
I think also, I mean, for the film I made in the last series, which was the first series that was ungeo-blocked, was in Nigeria, and there were huge ramifications from the fact that people could see it there. I know that the fixer, the local producer that we use, is the same person you use this time, and he got a lot of heat after the film came out. The Nigerian authorities took the film a lot more seriously because they could see it. A lot of people saw it in Nigeria and were horrified, and some people put a lot of pressure on the government to have done something. Some people were on the internet saying that we'd hired everybody and they were all actors, which was interesting. But yes, I mean, the films have a longer life, I think, if they can be viewable worldwide, and they have more of a meaning, certainly, and we have even more of a responsibility to the people included in them and the people who work with us making them.
I mean, to be honest, it's just great to be able to say to people, you can watch this,
Yeah.
and you can understand the program. I mean, most people in a lot of the places that we're going to will at some point in time get access to the internet, and the fact that they can go and watch themselves is I think it really dramatically changes the experience you have of normally going into places in the middle of nowhere and persuading people to be on television without them really having any understanding.
I was
of what
kind of
they're doing.
daunted though when it first happened. I kind of thought, actually, I'm going to have to tell people that everybody in their village is going to see them talking about everybody in their village, which isn't, well, I kind of liked the fact that I could say to people, I'm coming along, I'll film this thing, don't worry, it's all fine, I'll be gone in a couple of weeks.
You'll never see me again.
But so I suddenly had to kind of man up to the responsibility of what a TV camera really actually does and can do.
Yeah, no, I was going to say that the response I've had since it was ungeo-blocked has been wholly positive, especially in Syria. The moment they realised, because of course they want the whole world to know what's happening, the moment they realised that the whole world can see what's happening is when it kicked in, the network kicked in for us, and they really pulled out all the stops to help us. And the same happened with the film we made on smuggling, people smuggling in Israel, Egypt, Israel. It was exactly the same thing. The NGO workers who were helping the people trafficking victims, as soon as they realised this was going to be seen, they realised how powerful it is and how much this really can help them. And I think we all have experience of how it has helped.
Okay. Questions?
How do you feel about the future of documentary making? And do you fear a decline in sort of budgets and audience interest?
Overall, I mean, obviously there's concern about that, but I don't know. Every time we have this discussion, something happens. I mean, all of a sudden documentaries in cinema go through the roof. Everybody goes and sees them, or there's a new strand of some sort on the terrestrial channels, or one of the other satellite channels will pick up. I don't know. I don't see actually personally it dying or it going away. I mean, it's getting tighter. Money's tighter, obviously. Interest is getting shorter, but you've just got to tell better stories in maybe a shorter time. But I think it's always going to be there personally.
I'm not too sure about interest. I think the interest's always there, and that's what keeps us going. The money is less so. But we have to get more creative. We're in a generation which is completely different to 10 years ago. I mean, we don't have sound men, we don't have a whole bunch of things around us that the people used to have when they went abroad. We just go with just the two of us, a reporter and a producer director and a couple of mobile phones. So already we've reduced the costs, and we will have to go further. And I think people will find creative ways around that, because there is, as I say, the audience, there is the desire to hear the stories.
But I would add one thing to that. I think both BBC and Channel 4 need to maintain a really serious documentary presence, because in the case of the BBC, I think that if they're going to be taken seriously as an impartial national free-to-air broadcaster, they have to do it. Channel 4, it's very much part of what they do. I think it's very easy to bow to commercial pressures. I think it's very, very important that these major channels justify the fact that they are out there in the public domain by producing major documentaries and continuing to do so.
There's never been more, though. I mean, it's the bottom line. I mean, this industry is bigger than it's ever been. And yes, you might get individual strands or brands coming and going over the years, but I mean, I've always been a firm believer that the golden age of television is now, whenever you are, and that it's only got better as long as I've been working in this industry. Because it's just got bigger, and the cost should come down, because the cost of making documentaries come down.
Okay, more questions?
Thank you. Can you talk a little bit more about the technology, the new technology, and how that's kind of affecting or changing the way that you're making the films, and how the relationship between the producer-director and the journalist works, please?
Right, I'll answer the first part first. The last part first. They listen to what we say. No, look, it's a very close relationship where you both really get stuck into the whole story, and ultimately the producer-director is responsible for what goes on in the field and delivering the story, and they are in their rights to kick around the reporter as much as possible to make sure that they actually deliver a piece to camera that finishes a proper sentence for a change. And I'm looking at James. But in terms of new technology, do you mean cameras, or do you mean...
Cameras, editing, it's only two people that go out in the field and they do everything. So how do you use technology? What cameras?
I mean, very briefly, I mean, you know, the fact that we've gone tapeless is new, and that's made all sorts of efficiencies in the field and the way that you can see material and you can actually hide cards and you can do things differently than before. I don't know if anybody else would like to pick up on that theme, Wally, about new technology or the relationship with the directors, or Chris, what was your experience, I guess, working in a tight two-person team like this over a period of time?
Yep. I mean, fantastic. I mean, I mean, I've worked in sort of big teams, sort of 4 or 5 people, in news teams where you quite often it'll just be me and a cameraman. And this was sort of a different sort of experience again, where I mean, the workload on the PDs, the producer directors, is massive.
Yeah. Exactly.
And you know, Peter's right that they work arguably harder than the reporters. And,
arguably.
Disagree with
that. But the relationship is great in that. I mean, if it works really well, you know, you can divvy things up between, you know, in terms of responsibility. And when it works fantastically, in my experience, is when you basically have your individual areas of responsibility, but you have the relationship where you can actually suggest things to the other. And so I might suggest shots, a producer might suggest questions, you know, and you know, that's when it works fantastic.
I think that we ought to own up, us reporters. The producer directors are the boss. They tell us what to do. They tell us what to say. They tell us what to ask. And actually, it's an affront to decency. There aren't at least 3 of these PDs up here, and us reporters sitting and watching and learning how it's done. I'm sorry to be quite clear about that. And Ed Brayman will have kept you well in place in South Africa, and quite rightly so.
If he had produced me, he would have done it.
Yes.
I think it's important to say that different reporters work in different ways with their producer directors. Some are much more laid back. Some like to take a more hands-on, controlled approach to what they're doing. No, different reporters and different producer directors, they work in a different way, but I think being a producer director is an incredibly difficult job. You have to be responsible for so much. You're technically the boss. You're the boss of the fixer and the driver. You are in charge of the budget. You're in charge of all of the equipment. You're in charge of everything we shot, so if you lose anything, it's your fault.
Legally responsible for my health and safety.
Exactly, and I think
Suable.
I think that I've made a lot of these films now, and I have to say it's pretty much unheard of for me that you come to the end of making a film and you aren't bonded for life with the person that you've been making the film with, from all that you've gone through together, and it's a fantastic experience because you always work out a way of, well, hopefully always work out a way of working together.
The other thing
when it's perfect, I think, is when it's a real collaboration. And that's what it really is. So you co-produce.
Co-produce.
I mean, you're in it together, especially when you're somewhere like Syria. You know,
you have to be.
You look after each other's backs. You've got each other's backs. So everything you do, you're in it together. And we really share responsibility.
One other point.
Of us who sort of swan
one other point which needs
sorry, Peter.
And there are some of us who are slightly more involved.
There's one other point which badly needs making. That at the end of the day, you finish filming, or in the and you go, and the poor producer director has to ring head office. He has this 20-minute conversation with George Waldron. There he is, and Siobhan perhaps, I'm having a. I mean, you're sort of hard at work for me. So I am having a whiskey in the bar of the hotel. When poor old...
Right, okay, at this point, we've got a few more minutes. So, Peter, the lady at the back there, first of all.
I'd just like to know to the presenters and reporters, how did you actually get the job? Did Unreported World come to you and think, oh, you're great, or did you have to go knocking at their door quite often?
Is that a question because you'd like to pursue that? Yeah. I would say, first of all, I mean, to preface it, I mean, it can be both. I mean, but it's down to you to try and push forward yourself, to, again, try and meet people who are interested in what you're doing and put yourself forward, because they might not always know you're there or that you're interested. So in a positive, proactive way, you know, do that. But then if you try and do what Chris said before, you know, do films, get up on air, get on YouTube, do whatever you can, get noticed, and then people will come to you also. Has anybody else got a view on that? No?
Yeah, I was very lucky. I mean, I was living in China for a while and speaking a language skill, which is Mandarin, which I speak very badly. But we managed to make a film about being inside coal mines, which no one else had got. And it was clearly, I think, something which the team really wanted to do. So having a particular expertise in a particular place can sometimes open up doors to into the right place if you're lucky, as well as banging on the door very loudly and hoping they'll answer it. And if they don't, keep kicking it.
Okay, I'll move it on if I may, just to keep it moving with the time. The lady here.
I'd just like to know individually which film you either was your favourite to make or that you're most proud of.
I would like to say before anybody, I mean, I think it's funny, to me, and it sounds maybe a bit silly, but every film I'm proud of for a different reason, actually. It's very hard to actually say what you're most proud of, for me anyway. Each one has their difficulties and challenges, but there's always something there.
It's quite an easy one for me. I'm most proud of and enjoyed making the Ivory Coast film the most because it was this is the most intense experience of my life. I felt more alive and more relevant. It sounds like a weird thing to say than I ever have done before. It was tense and stressful, but also incredibly enjoyable because I was doing what I wanted to do, what I've always wanted to do. And then, at the end of it, you get to watch that film and go, there is a record of what I did. That's great. There's no better feeling.
Jen?
It's difficult. You get so involved with the films, and each one is an incredibly important thing to you. I mean,
is there one that stands out?
There's the films that I've made recently, the Nigeria film that I made, and also the film that I made in the Philippines last year about overpopulation. I enjoyed doing it because I was able to look at this particular extreme situation, and first of all, it was a situation that was a kind of case study of what might happen to the rest of the world, and so it wasn't just something exotic, it was something that had resonance for all of us. But also, the film wasn't about victims, it was about incredibly resilient survivors and the ingenuity of these people living in these very extreme circumstances, and it was just fascinating to see how people were coping. So I kind of came away from that film with my eyes completely wide in awe of these people, and also thinking, God, is this how we're going to have to adapt?
As you said, I've bonded with some aspect of every single film. It's so hard to say one. When I was in Afghanistan, I felt very comfortable. It was the first time that I could really speak the language, understand the culture, and I was really welcomed and given amazing access. And it was a problem I understood really well because the opium addiction, heroin addiction, is huge in Iran, so it was very close to my heart. And actually, on the same note, I've got a real bond with Syria because revolution happened in my country, Iran, and I remember it, and it changed my life. And it was a really emotional experience for me, actually. I was really moved covering those protests, and a few times I actually found myself welling up because it was very close to home.
Okay, a few more questions before we close. The lady at the back there.
Hi, I was just wondering, what are all of your career backgrounds? Because I know that Peter does a lot of print journalism, but I was wondering if any of you started out as a runner or a researcher within a production company and then worked your way up.
Okay, can I add that to a couple of more questions? Because we can add that to, there was a lady at the back there as well.
I just wanted to know, after you guys have left the countries that you've done your documentaries in, how do you protect the people that have helped you? And have there been any repercussions for them after you guys have gone?
Okay, I'll start with that one if I could, very briefly. I mean, we take extreme care as much as we possibly can. It's obviously very, 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 very important to us and to them that they are protected as much as possible. Often in a situation where somebody could get into trouble, we try and give them deniability, where a situation may be that you're working with them in some aspects, but you may not work with them in a very sensitive area, for example, so that they can say to anybody who questions them, I wasn't there doing that. They went off and did that themselves, for example. We try and stay in touch with them, and we have a very clear conversation with them about what we're trying to do, so that they tell us the amount of risk that they're willing to take. Would anybody like to pick up on that?
Yeah, I mean, I try in certain situations.
I'll come to yours.
People aren't really sure about the risk they're taking. I give them what I call the black talk, which is just saying, look, if this is how bad things can really get, and you've really got to understand what it is. And we're going to do everything we possibly can to protect you and to hide your identity and all the rest of it. But people also need to take the understand what they're actually getting themselves in for, because sometimes they don't.
Yeah, most of the protection is done on the ground. I think once we get back here, we're just monitoring the situation and trying to make sure that we're aware of what's going on. But everything that you do on the ground, whether it's how often you're seen with them, in which locations, and so on and so forth, that's an ongoing process.
And it's also listening to them when they're on the ground, if they have concerns on the ground. I mean, recently in the film that I just made, we were going to potentially put some hard questions to some people that had some dodgy connections, and our fixer was worried about what the ramifications could be for him, and I talked him through it, and I was, if he's worried, it's completely legitimate, we'll find a way of doing it without you being there. And sometimes people ask to not have their names in the credits, and we respect that.
Just to follow on there about the background, I mean, I think you're right, everybody comes from a very different background. I mean, I personally started making lunch in a copy room in Tasmania, Australia, where I was buying lunch for the sub-editor and usually getting that wrong. And, so I think everybody's come from different backgrounds. Chris, you started with...
Yeah, I got my first job, I have a very unusual background, and my first job in television was as a presenter when I was 18.
Fully formed.
And I then sort of backwards engineered my career, and I became an assistant producer on Newsnight, and then a reporter, and kind of came back to presenting. But I got my first job by doing work experience and being pushy, and at the end of that sort of work experience period, they said, actually, we're looking for somebody to present that show. We want to screen test you. And so, yeah, very, very unusual. But I mean, with that, I think there was someone else who was asking about it, about what advice. And the advice I always give to people is, in this industry, you often get told, don't try and run before you can walk. You've got to try and do this first. You should go and spend 5 years on a national newspaper desk and blah, blah, it's kind of bollocks. I mean, if I believe I can do this, I'm going to try and do it. And if somebody won't give me a job, then I'll try and do it anyway. So reach high.
Very, very quick from each one of them. Seyi, what did you say?
Yeah, very similar to Krishnan actually. I did some presenting beforehand. Then I came in as a runner and worked my way up through to assistant producer. You do get to a stage, you can be as pushy and as you want to be, you get to a stage where you do have to get out there and start doing it yourself if you want to, I suppose, jump the queue. Otherwise you can sit and wait for 10 years and you'll get your chance.
Okay. I won't carry on. We'll get a few more questions before we can close, if that's okay. Yep.
I think for Ollie mainly, you said the access to earn people's trust is difficult. Is that more difficult in a place like Australia, or you compare it to like Uganda, where there might not be the exposure already?
Yeah, I think it's very different in every different community, and it's a trust issue, which can be part of your team as well. You need to have good people who can win people's trust, and that can undermine things at times. But no, it's I think particularly with tribal peoples and indigenous peoples around the world, there are certain certain people have had their trust completely destroyed. And this was one particular case where their trust had been completely annihilated by other people. So I think it was a pretty isolated case, but I think by and large we all have to earn people's trust if we want to work with them. If we don't, then you've got to ask a question, why not?
Okay, I think it's 9 p.m. That's pretty much all we've got time for tonight. We'll be around for any other questions afterwards. But thank you very much, everybody, for coming along tonight. And of course, a big welcome to Krishnan onto the program for us.